Alrighty, so up next we are going to take a look at our plugin section here. So the plugin area down here is where you're going to see all your plugins, all your effects, things like that. And you'll also be able to see all of your audio clip view. So to toggle between the two, you can click here at this rectangle and you'll get the device view. And next to that, you'll get your clip view. So let's also pop up here our info view. So to see what plugins are on a track, you could just click the track and you'll sort of see what tracks have plugins and which don't. If you want to add plugins to a certain track, you can click it, type in the plugin you're looking for, and double click the plugin, and it'll automatically jump to the last selected track that you clicked here. Alternatively, you could click and drag plugins on the track. You could drag them straight in here. So you have many ways to go about it. So let's go ahead and delete these. So now that we have a plugin here and we know how to get them on our tracks, let's take a look at some of these top navigation controls. So this one will just expand or contract information depending on the plugin. That information will vary, and I'll show you some other examples. This one, it functions similarly to the mute button. Basically it turns a device on or off, and any parameter here, including the device on or off, as you can see in our automation view, can be automated. So if you have a certain part of a vocal that you want to automate an effect on, you can do that, or you could even automate a mix control. So by clicking a certain parameter, you can see we get different automation lanes, and then we can go ahead and just start automating it. On our EQ here, basically any plugin, you can hit Command R and rename it. So if you have a certain EQ, say you like to use very often or something like that, and this is going to be your vocal EQ, you could save that and then use it at a later time. So just know that you can do that, and you could always right click and delete. Alright, up next let's take a look at some MIDI stuff. As you can see, it says drop instrument here. That just means that we haven't loaded an instrument for the MIDI to play through. So to do that, we can click under our Instruments tab or our Plugins tab, depending where our instruments are. Double click an instrument and it'll populate here. Same thing, you could also click and drag or drag onto your track here in the timeline. Now, if I were to double click another instrument here, it would actually go ahead and replace this one. So it works as an overwrite. If I want to have multiple instruments playing through the same MIDI, you could also do that. So as you can see here, we have collision. Okay, so as you can see, my record button is not showing up quickly. That's because my input does not exist. It had no input. So now we have all our inputs. We can record enable this. And there you can see we have our sound. If I wanted to have multiple sounds playing through here, I could hit Command G. Command G will create a group. So these groups can be used for audio effects as well as audio instruments. For example, if I had this group and we wanted this to be some sort of preset of compressors, call it ultimate compression, you can name this group. By double clicking the group, it will expand or collapse it, basically any device, so I can also collapse them here. And then I could go ahead and save, and I'll get something like that. So let's go ahead and delete that because we don't actually want that. So what we're looking at here is two separate groups. One of them is audio based, with our compressors here, and one of them is MIDI based. So since we have an instrument here, you can see we have an instrument rack, and then here this was an audio effect rack. If I drop a second instrument here, let's go ahead and do that. Let's say we want analog and we want some sort of pad. I can drag and drop it here, and now you see we have two chains, and we have our volume fader, a pan fader, a device on or off, basically a mute function, and then a solo button. Right next to that we have a swap mode, which basically just allows you to switch an instrument. So now if I press a note, you can hear we have our pad and this extra instrument playing, and you can go further than that and add as many instruments as you want. Let's add a sub bass here. And I could solo these and hear what they're doing. And I can go further and start EQing these elements so that they all have their own individual space. So some methods I might use is EQ, cutting out the highs and the sub bass, cutting out the highs of the pad maybe, and then cutting out all the lows of this high end here. So one thing about this basic sub sign actually, which is a great tool in Ableton, if I solo this, you can see I have a lot of macros, distortion. So that's a great one, and I was gonna EQ this, but under here in the instrument you can see it's already EQ'd. If I wanted, I could change this to something more aggressive here, like this, and then I could EQ all the other parts and create something that isn't muddy. Moving on here, if we take a look at all of these options within our group, so at the top here we have macro controls. These controls can be assigned to anything in our instruments. So say we want our octave controls to go to macro 1. I can do that. I can map the tune here. And say we'll do this pan too. So this knob now controls both of those knobs. And you can assign as many as you want. And you can assign multiples. So macro 2, if that's a pitch. Once I have multiple kind of parameters on here, it'll default to macro, but as you can see here I only have one, so it named it appropriately. Of course you could always change this, so say this is octave, and you can do that for all of these. You could even recolor them, create custom colors, and that brings us to our next kind of topic here. If we're going down the list of buttons, we have a plus icon, which gives us more macros, and we have a minus button, which takes away some macros. Another quick thing here, we have this random button, which will randomize our macro, which is a really cool feature. Next to that, we have our variations, which allows us to create variations of macro sets. So if I hit new here, this is variation 1. If I hit new again, variation 2, let's change some things around, and then we create a snapshot with this little camera icon. Now if I double click back to 1, we have our first variation, our second variation. I create a new one, randomize it, save it, and now we have another. So that's a really cool way to go about that, and you could rename them, duplicate, or delete them by right clicking. So now let's turn off our macros, turn off our variations, and our device list. This one here. So we have our device list, and then we can show or hide our devices with this button. Now let's take a quick kind of look at some of our features here in our audio chain. Here I can right click in this area and create a chain. So say this is our first chain of compression, and then say I wanted to have some reverb on this other chain. I could add some reverb to the chain. I can make the dry wet 100%. That way we don't have any overlapping dry signals, and I can affect this reverb however I want, and they would both play simultaneously. So now I should be able to hear some reverb on my sound. And unsolo this. As you can see, we have our reverb. So let's dive in here, see if there's anything else we should mention. But I feel like that pretty much covers our groups. So we can collapse these groups, save them. And then there's this map button here, which allows you to quickly select a knob and just click map and keep going. You can add as many macros. Just click one of the green boxes and map them. Then you can uncheck map, and now all of this will reflect your changes. Alright, so that is our device view. And let's talk about our clip view now, because that's what will be next. Our clip view is where we'll be doing anything regarding our clips. So if I want to warp this vocal performance or quantize it, I can do that here. So if I play this.
Standing in the rain, feather down in my brain, I was doing silly things just to make.
Alright, so I had this weird rumble. Let's just get rid of that. So let's click back in our clip. So you can see here, we have all these little lines on this. And when you're in warp mode, as you can see here, those lines will appear, and without it, they won't. Warp allows you to create warp markers, which then allows you to change sounds. So say I want this breath to hit right here instead, and then warp this here.
Standing in the rain.
Then I can do that. And depending on which warp mode will affect the sound of the warping. So beats normally has a choppy feel and is used more on drums and things like that.
Standing in the rain, feather down in my brain.
And you can see I have different options for how this beats will behave. So right now it's trying to analyze transients and reproduce those transients accordingly. If I change this, say, to 16th notes, then it'll try to analyze the 16th notes. So it got this weird vibrato thing going on. And then this changes kind of the program mode. So if I hit this one, it'll actually try to play and stop, and I'll get something more choppy depending on this envelope here.
Standing in the rain, feather down in my brain.
Which is a really cool little effect there.
Standing.
And you can change the rate. Up next we have tones.
Standing in the rain, feather down.
So if I stretch that, the higher my grain size, the more clear. The lower, we get something a little more choppy.
Standing in the rain, feather down in my brain.
So that's tones, and then we have textures.
Standing in the rain, feather down.
And you can play with these parameters. It just, like it says, has a lot more texture, metallic-y. Repitch will just either lower or higher the pitch depending on stretch or compression. So in this case,
standing in the rain, feather down.
You can see as I stretched it, it got lower, and as I contract it, it'll get higher.
Rain, feather down.
Yeah, so that's pretty weird, but cool to know that we have that option. And then we have complex, which is a more accurate way of warping audio.
Standing in the rain, feather. Standing in the rain, feather down in my brain.
And then complex pro goes even further.
Standing in the rain, feather down in my brain. Standing in the rain, feather down in my brain. I was doing silly things just.
So as you can see, doing this, you can come in here and change our grid size and just quantize audio and performances very easily. Now, sometimes if you have to stretch these a little too far, it'll be really obvious that you warped it.
Standing in the rain, feather down in my brain.
So you do have to be careful with this, but just know that it's there. And then next to that, we have our divide to or multiply to button.
Standing in the rain, feather down in my brain. I was doing.
Which just speeds up or slows down things.
Standing in the rain.
By a factor of 2, so you're either half timing or double timing there. And then we have our gain knob, which adjusts the volume of this clip. And then we have our semitones. So as you can see, this changes the pitch. Creepy. But you also have fine tuning here, which is cents. And under that, we have our envelopes, which allows us to create pitch automation. So if I was to go like this.
Standing
then you get something really weird. And you can play around with that.
Standing in the rain.
So that's how you would transpose things with an envelope, and you can always hit Alt and curve these.
Standing in the rain. Standing in the.
So that's great. And you have a bunch of different things you could actually automate here. So you could even do gain.
Standing in the rain. Further down.
Which is really cool. And what else do we have here? As you can see here, we have this top loop bracket too. If I were to create a loop or something here, you can see it then populates this as a loop.
Further down.
So you can do things like that and change the length of the loop. And I think that's pretty much everything here that you need to know about. And maybe we can take a quick look at our MIDI editor since we're here. So our MIDI editor, we have our transport stuff here in the clip view. We have a scale button here, which allows us to choose a scale. So if I want to write in D minor, you can see everything stayed green, and that's because there's a scale button. It highlights all the notes within the scale, and by clicking scale, it reduces all of the notes that are not in the scale. So you could quickly write chords this way. That's really loud. I'm going to cut that out. So you could write chords that way and write melodies, everything in key. So double clicking on this here editor will create notes. Likewise, you can hit B, which gives you your pencil tool. You can quickly write many notes that way. And you can hit the divide to or half time or double time. So that's what these do. You can reverse or invert things. So Command A will select all your notes. I just want to display how this reverse button works, and inverting, and legato. Legato will try to fill in any gaps in your MIDI notes. So see that there. And duplicate just duplicates that MIDI. Randomizing randomizes your velocity. So if we take a look down here, I'm going to do Command A once again. All of this is our velocities stocks. So these kind of stocks here allow you to change the pressure that a key is pressed. So the lower it is, the softer it will be pressed. So by hitting randomize, now since I'm using Serum, I have to do some extra work. So basically I just need to map my velocity to my instrument, and let's give this something worth listening to. There we go. Alright, let's solo this. So as you can see, everything is legato right now, so it's a little hard to hear kind of what's going on. But if I select everything and get rid of my pencil tool, this will turn into a trim icon. Since I'm casting my keys, it doesn't show up, but you'll see it. Wow, so there it is. So that's what velocity does, and as you can see, that was a really drastic velocity change, so I'm just going to select all this, put it back all up. And as you can see, we heard all those notes. That's this little blue headphone icon. If I now do that, you won't hear them. This allows you to audition when you click. Lets you hear the note you're playing. If that's off, you actually won't hear anything. So that you can toggle on and off. And I was just going to show you this range here. If I lower the range to something like 15, now the values that it randomizes by will be between 1 and 15. You can see that's a lot less drastic. And velocity range will just kind of give you randomization between a range. So it'll randomly choose to play a velocity between where it's at and minus 28 of where it's at. And you can set that however you like. Up next we have our envelopes here, which allows you to adjust certain parameters directly within your MIDI. So as you can see here, we have serum. And something that would make this really easy to tell is the filter on. If I turn the filter off right around here, you can kind of hear that so yeah, just knowing that that's there is great. And I mean, you could always automate this directly on your timeline as well. And you have your note expression. Now expression's pretty rad. If I click a note here, oh, where'd it go? Let's see. So let's also touch on the zoom here. You gotta click over these keys and drag left or right to zoom in. So I'm zooming in here. Let's click this. This gives me some expression controls. So right now I'm in scale, so there's a little caveat with that. If you are in scale mode, you won't see this pitch bend range here. So just turning that off and then pitching up allows you to add some pitch ranges to certain notes, which for some reason we are looping over here. I don't want to play back from there. Now, the problem with this one was it is MPE enabled, except MPE is actually affecting our pitch wheel here, and our range is not high enough. So you can kind of hear that. So that's good to know. And you have slide and pressure. Now, for the case of a beginner, you may not be using many of these MPE features unless you have an MPE controller, which then that MPE data would be recorded in. Alright, I think that's everything for this section. We'll go ahead and move on to our session view, which is this.